So thank you so much for having me. It's brilliant to be here. Obviously, very interesting times here for us in the UK. If you're a press or public information officer, because at the moment there is no science or research news at all following the death of the Queen. So very, very interesting times for us at the moment, where we're normally really busy every day dealing with science news stories, but there's none of that going on. So actually it's quite a good time to take a step back and talk about some of the broader issues. So as Ewan said, they've asked me to talk about a report that the Science Media Centre and I published recently about the role of science press officers, particularly in the UK, and how that has changed over the last 20 years. And just for clarity, I know we have lots of different job titles in the UK here. So I mean, press officers, communications officers, media relations managers. I think you often refer to them in Japan as PIOs, public information or PR officers. So that's what I'm talking about. And if you want to know more about the Science Media Centre, we can share the link with you, or I'm happy to answer questions on kind of who we are and more background to that. But today's talk is really about the report and what we've done. And as Ewan said, because it was the 20th anniversary of the Science Media Centre, we wanted to take a step back and have a look at the ecosystem of science communication and science media relations in the UK, and really try and gather some evidence about how that's changed over the years, whether that leaves any gaps or opportunities for the future. So the report is the changing role of science press officers, or CROSSBO. And as I've said, it's really about, it's not very detailed academic research, but hopefully it gives a really good, solid snapshot of how the roles of PIOs have changed here, specifically in universities. So we focused on universities in the first instance, and it was really about gathering some of the evidence and to look at how those roles have changed and what the impacts might be for people doing the job on the ground, and also how we might support them in the future. And just to say that all the way through the project, which I think is really important to the work that we've done, we've had funding and support from lots of different parts of the science community in the United Kingdom. So for this project, we were funded by our Academy of Medical Sciences, and we also had support from an organisation called STEMPRA. Some of you may have heard of it, but it's an informal network of science press officers and research comms people in the UK. So very briefly, what we did was we used 3 different types of methodology to gather our evidence. The first of these was structured online interviews with people working as press officers in the UK or who've previously done the role. And we spoke to a range of them, starting from early career press officers to media managers, directors of communications. And we also spoke to some of the senior leadership in universities, so their vice chancellors and research provosts, just to really give us a good sense across a range of universities and roles, how the job was for people now, but also how it had changed. In addition to that, we ran an online survey across the UK to kind of gather more quantitative data about some of the issues. We had lots of respondents to the survey, and a large number of them were from universities, particularly, so we collected that information as well. And then finally, we used a market research company called Ipsos Mori, and they ran some focus groups for us with researchers themselves to find out what their current expectations are of the support they might expect from their university and for their press officers. So in terms of what we found, I will try and keep it brief, and then I can expand on certain things in the Q&A at the end. But these findings are all very much what we heard from the people we spoke to who were doing the job on the ground. And I have to say that although quite a number of different issues came up, the themes and the issues that were raised were actually fairly consistent. And that's true across the 3 different types of methodology that we use. So even though it was a fairly short piece of research, we're fairly confident in what we found. So in terms of how the roles of press officers have changed here in the UK, we heard that over the last 20 years, as I'm sure many of you are aware, it's really become a very established profession, which is really good news for us. We now have a really strong network across our universities and research institutions of people with lots of experience and expertise in terms of helping researchers to engage with the public and engage with the news media. As the profession has become established and expected, it's often got more influence in a university and an organisation, and also kind of more responsibility and very much an expanded remit. So many press officers talk to us how in the early days, their role was very much about just answering the odd call from a journalist or trying to help publicise a new piece of research or a scientific paper. And now they still do those jobs, but they also are much more involved in things like the reputation management of their organisation, the kind of corporate strategic issues that they seem to get involved on a much more regular basis. So the profession has really grown and become established. In many ways, that's been a real positive, because for press officers, they have more resources than they used to do. Most universities in the UK now have a communications team or department with lots of different specialists within it. But I have to say, we heard from people that that's not true across the board. So in some universities where these skills and the value that they could bring were recognised, they're very well resourced. But in other places, that's not the case. And where that's become difficult for press officers on the ground is that they now have a much bigger role, but perhaps not the resources or the time they need to actually fulfil it properly. So that's causing some problems. In addition, their skills have really broadened and diversified. And I'd be very interested to see or hear the perspective from yourselves in Japan. So previously, it was very much, as I've said, about media relations skills, talking to journalists, finding stories, writing press releases. Now it's about how many different audiences do they have to engage with, social media platforms, being more strategic, being more corporate, and just kind of trying to do a lot more in the same amount of time. So for some of them, they felt individually that this was a real benefit, because actually their skills had really developed in their careers, and they felt like that was very good for their own personal career development and the jobs that they're able to do in future. Whereas for others at a senior level, they were struggling now because they felt like people coming into this as a career are not so specialist anymore. So people have become much more generalist. And actually, when you need specialists on a very difficult, complex issue or a big media crisis, they were finding it hard to recruit the people with the skills and experience to do that job. So a real kind of mixed bag there. And then obviously, as I'm sure is the case for all of you, real increase in pace and pressure that has particularly accelerated over the last few years with the COVID-19 pandemic. So everybody talking about working weekends, working long days, never enough hours in the day. And so that was becoming, for some of them, very, very overwhelming and making it almost too hard to do the job, and making them rethink kind of their future career choices. And then in terms of what they perceived as the drivers of those changes, I think there'll be no surprises here. So the first of these is the way in which the media landscape has changed. So as I've said, an explosion of digital and social media platforms for them to manage. Many of them having to become content producers themselves, as well as respond reactively to stories from journalists. The fact that media stories are now much more 24-hour constant news, global, again, particularly in the pandemic. Everybody needs something yesterday. And so for many of them, a real challenge to stay on top of all those different audiences and all the different channels. Again, some of them in the places where they had the support at a senior level and the resources for this actually have been able to capitalise on those changes and use channels themselves to get their own messages out to the media and the public, without them going through the lens, for example, of the tabloids here in the UK. So many press officers now and universities setting up long form journalism websites as part of their organisations, having their own podcasts, YouTube channels, things like that. So things that allow them to tell them stories themselves and give them greater control of the narrative. And that was seen as a positive. I think as is probably the case in many parts of the world, societal debate has really shifted and become very high stakes, particularly here in the UK. So a lot of organisations and universities now much more risk averse about getting involved in issues that are in the news and the headlines because they're concerned about the impact on their reputation. Universities here particularly under real financial and political pressure, and that was really affecting the way that press officers were able to do their jobs. And kind of linked on from that, many of them that we talked to talked about how the marketisation of universities in the UK had made a real difference to them, and mostly not in a good way. So in many places now, obviously, there's a real pressure on the financial bottom line and budgets in universities. It's since the introduction of fees over here in the UK, it's meant that we now treat students as consumers, and universities very much are about attracting students both locally and globally, and putting a lot of their investment in communication has actually gone towards marketing. So a lot of kind of traditional press officers and media relations officers finding that they now have to compete with very large marketing teams. So in some places, there might be a team of 6 or 7 press officers and then a department of 100 people working in student marketing and recruitment. And with that comes the challenge that they need to compete with them for resources. And also many of them saying it's more difficult to prove your value as a press officer than it is if you're working in marketing, where you can say that we've increased the number of students that we've recruited, or there's an increased number of engagements on social media, but actually it's much harder to prove the benefits of if you get a piece of news coverage or that kind of communications output. So that was causing a lot of problems, but it's not across the board. So again, in some universities with enough resources, they've been able to kind of grow the press officers' work and the marketing alongside each other, so they support each other and they can share content. But in many places, the marketing was kind of pushing out the media relations. And then, as I've already said, the pandemic had accelerated these trends. And then some people that we spoke to talked about how pressure from government, their location, so if they were based outside of a city, and particularly outside of London, their jobs were much harder, because we're still very much in a space in the UK where many things are London centric. And then kind of what we think that means for the researchers that you're trying to get to engage with the media, and to do more communication. I think we're very lucky in the UK. So because of this professionalisation of the role over the last 20 years, there are more scientists and researchers who are willing to speak to the media, and they're better at it. Although now press officers talked about how many scientists actually bypass their press office. They don't go to them anymore because they feel the press officer is too busy dealing with some of the things that I've talked about. So they just speak to journalists themselves. They don't get the support from the press office they need. And if they're well established, they feel confident to do that. But for press officers, it was causing problems because they're not aware of when their experts are talking to journalists, so they were getting caught out by stories that they weren't aware of. And another issue that would be interesting to hear the perspective from Japan, but many people talked about not just kind of fake news and misinformation, but actually harassment and online abuse of researchers who are engaging with the media. And actually that's a growing problem here in the UK. And many of them felt they didn't have the support. So press officers Only 1 in 3 of the press officers we spoke to said that they were aware that they had any policies in their university for supporting researchers who were experiencing harassment, and that was putting researchers off doing the media engagement. In terms of public trust in science, obviously all these issues create a bit of a problem. If press officers are too busy to do the job and scientists are finding it hard to engage with the media, what does that mean for the information the public receive when there are big public health or science issues such as COVID-19 in the media? And if institutions are quite risk averse about stepping forward, are we at risk in the UK, where we've done really well and we've come a long way in 20 years in terms of being open on animal research and getting scientists and universities to engage? Are we at a point where we might risk going backwards if we don't actually do something to try and tackle some of these things? And then I think for yourselves, I thought it'd be interesting to just say something about the impact on the press officers themselves, what it means for them in terms of their day-to-day work. So many of them really love their jobs, really passionate, want to make a difference to the lives of other people and to the information the public receive. And that passion was carrying them through quite a lot of the challenges they were dealing with. But unfortunately, many of them now said they felt really undervalued and unsupported. So they felt like they were working really hard, but they couldn't compete with their colleagues in marketing. They didn't have the staff they needed. They were struggling to get the career development they needed, particularly at a senior level. And also for the senior ones, they were struggling to recruit people to work in their teams with the skills they needed. And as I've said, very poor work-life balance. And for many of them now, and I think probably one of the most surprising things we learned was that over 80% of them said they'd considered leaving their jobs in the last 5 years. And 1 in 3 of that 80% said they'd thought about it often. So I think there's a real challenge for us here in the UK that although we're in quite a healthy state, we're we're in a position where probably, not through anybody's fault or but for lots of complex reasons, we might have real challenges here to kind of support the field. I've got a couple more slides that I'll just skip through because I know I'm nearly up to my 20 minutes. One thing that I wanted to say, and I can expand on in the questions if people are interested, is that we did make recommendations from the report. So we didn't want it to just be, here's a list of all the things that are going wrong, but with no suggestions for how to tackle them. And so these are the recommendations, actually not so much from us in the Science Media Centre, but actually this is what people told us might help the situation. So one was around universities prioritising and resourcing research and science communication alongside marketing. Another was that within that, universities need to value and resource media relations skills, particularly because while there is a real narrative, at least in the UK, that the news media don't matter anymore, many press officers talk to us about the fact how actually that was still the news media at the moment here are still the main way that the UK public get most of their information about science. So they still very much matter. The media, they may get that information through other channels on social media, but it's actually still coming from the trusted media brands like the BBC and the Guardian and those journalists. And then the Science Media Centre itself needs to do more to support universities to help them value and see the impact of engaging with the news, and also that at the SMC we need to champion the role of specialist press officers. So in the past, when science journalists have struggled in the newsrooms in the UK, the SMC has done a lot to support them and champion their roles. And now we feel like we need to do the same for specialist science press officers. Additionally, we think the science community needs to think more clearly about how it supports the careers of science press officers. We need to think particularly about this issue of harassment and whether there's something we can do collectively. And then finally, we're obviously, as I'm sure you may be in Japan, we've got a lot of inquiries going on now into the lessons learned from the pandemic. And we think it's important that those inquiries include the consideration of the roles that were played by press officers and PIOs. Here are the reports that we produced for this research. And again, we can share the links with those if you want to go on and read them. And then the last point I wanted to make was just what I referred to at the beginning, where we felt it's really important not just to do this work, but to go out and talk about it, to engage with groups like the Russell Group and Universities UK, but also brilliantly to be able to come and do talks like this one internationally and learn from our colleagues in different countries. So we've been doing a lot to try and make sure that we're raising this issue. And actually, it's surprised us how much interest we've had, which I think has been fantastic. We've had support from people like our Chief Scientific Advisor and many other of the leaders of the UK science community, which has really helped. And we've also been out giving interviews and making sure that we can raise the profile of some of these issues and make sure they're being considered. So I think that's all I wanted to say. There's a couple of ideas here for things that we might want to talk about, or you may have your own questions as well. But thank you so much for listening. It's absolutely brilliant to be able to meet you all. And I will leave it there. Thank you.